It's Dr. Meyer. We're going to talk today more about perimenopause and how to test for perimenopause. Hey, it's Dr. Shelley Meyer. Welcome back to my channel. If you're returning, welcome. If you're here for the first time, I'm a functional medicine doctor, family doctor, and registered dietitian, and I discuss gut health, hormone health, and metabolic health and testing on this channel. So lately, I've transitioned back over to female hormone health and particularly perimenopause, the stages and ages and years before we hit menopause. So I've worked with so many patients in my practice on this, so many women, and it can be confusing and there can be so much misinformation out there or lack of information out there for women. So that's why I came back to this series. I have a series, a playlist that I'll put in the description that you can look at with all my other hormone balance and perimenopause topics, but I'm revisiting this because I get so many questions both in my personal practice and from those videos. So I would recommend watching the last 2 weeks of videos, which was, I started out with the 34 symptoms of perimenopause because there can be a lot of things that you might not associate with perimenopause. And then I also talked about the stages last week of perimenopause. And that was a pretty simple, quick video. The first one I talked about 34 symptoms, of course, was 34 symptoms. So it took quite a while to go over those. But the stages were relatively straightforward. I mean, they don't always manifest the same and in the same order with every woman, but there's a lot of good information there. So I recommend going back to that if you haven't watched it. But today, let's talk about testing for perimenopause. And I can tell you at the start of this video, there's not one specific test for perimenopause. Keep watching though. There's some information, there's a lot of information, but there's some things you can do to kind of narrow that down and see what stage you might be in. So I do see some tests marketed through at-home testing. Everlywell has a test that they market as menopause or perimenopause test. Basically what they're looking at there is follicle stimulating hormone. I think they look at estradiol and luteinizing hormone. So let's talk about those to begin with, because that is often what I test for too, either through LabCorp or Quest. Those are the ones in the US that we use primarily through insurance-based practices. So we can test that in a doctor's office at a regular lab. We can look at the FSH, the LH, the estradiol, and the progesterone. So when and how do we look at those? Typically, we will look at FSH and LH when we're talking about perimenopause. We'll look at it in if you're still having regular cycles, day 19 through 22 of your cycle. The thing with FSH and LH is they are stimulating hormones. So they come down from the pituitary to give the message to our ovaries to make more eggs, to better egg production, better egg quality, get ready for ovulation, that kind of thing. But they typically don't get freaked out or high, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the actual last stage of perimenopause, which when you're about to go to menopause. The FSH and LH don't get high until the late stages. So there's a few years before that where your hormones your estrogen and progesterone could be surging and dropping, but the FSH and LH may be surging themselves and coming back down. It's really a very up and down hormone, as far as hormones go, up and down hormone stage time. It's not probably proper English, but you know what I mean. So that's why when somebody says they have the perimenopause test that you need to do, there's so many stages, there's not one test. There's not a ton of stages, but there's so much variability that there's not one test. So those tests will look at the FSH and LH. So what you're looking for with those tests that they're calling, positive perimenopause, or basically we should call them menopause tests, because it means the higher those numbers go, the closer you are to menopause. They often look at FSH level with CRM or blood testing of greater than 25 or LH of greater than 20. And I have a really great PDF if you don't want to memorize all these numbers. If you want to, there's a ratio I'm going to talk about that's kind of confusing. And I have it all on paper. So just get my free PDF that you can download. And that way you can take that information to your doctor and get those levels tested if you're curious. So that's the FSH and LH. So we typically will do those to day 19 through 22 of your cycle if you're having regular cycles. Now, as you learned in the last videos, you could be not having regular cycles anymore when you're in perimenopause. They may come more frequently than they used to. They may come less frequently than they used to, and they may be very unpredictable. So really your doctor could look at the FSH and LH anytime. It's just during that test, we're often going to also ask you to do estradiol and progesterone. And those it's better to look at in the luteal phase. But if you can't get a good handle on when your cycles are going to happen, just go ahead and check those. But when we talk about this ratio that I'm going to talk about, it's much better to do that in the luteal phase. So that would be typically like the third week of your cycle. So you go, day 1 would be the first day of bleeding. Then you go through like your follicular phase where you build up the lining. You have where you build up the hormones, and then you have your ovulation phase. So during the follicular phase, you're actually building up the egg. Ovulation, you're releasing the egg. And then luteal phase, you're building up the environment to have a better environment to make a baby, basically, to let the egg fertilize, or after the egg fertilizes, to let it kind of grow. So those are your stages. And when I say luteal phase, I mean that later phase, which is after ovulation, and when it's the progesterone surges, estrogen surges, typically when everything's acting normally. Now that's the problem. In perimenopause, everything's not always acting normally. So we try to catch it in that day 19 through 22, with day 1 being the first day of bleeding, but we aren't always able to catch it there. But I like to look for estrogen dominance when I'm looking at the first stage of perimenopause. So that's the first few years. And then the second stage is when both your estrogen and progesterone drop. But when you're estrogen dominant, that estrogen will surge higher than the progesterone, because your progesterone is gradually dropping during perimenopause. So you may have some of those symptoms that we talked about, that I talked about in the first video of this series, which is like mood swings and heavy periods and trouble sleeping, that waking up between 1 and 3 in the morning, irritability. You could have hair loss sometimes. There's just a lot of things that can be off during that. Sometimes your skin will break out during that estrogen dominance. So check out my 34 symptoms of perimenopause and my stages video. So you want to look for that when you're looking at with your doctor, and this is all in my PDF on estrogen and progesterone levels. Look at that ratio. So basically you look at the progesterone to estrogen ratio, and you're looking at, a ratio of 100 to 500. And if you're less than that 100, that could indicate estrogen dominance. Again, it's not an exact science. So that's where all of this stuff comes with the caveat. One thing I really like to do is the Dutch test. And again, we try to do that in the luteal phase, day 19 through 22 of the cycle. And the Dutch test is expensive. Yes, I know that. But it is a urine test that they have a saliva one too, but a urine test. And you can check out the link to order that in my lab shop. And it shows us a better way to look at estrogen and how it breaks down. So if you're estrogen dominant at that time, and then we can check and see if your estrogen is breaking down in a more toxic kind of way, in a more cancer-causing potential way. So if you're estrogen dominant, we want to know if you have a high risk for cancers that are related to estrogen. We can not necessarily tell if you have cancer. Well, we can't tell if you have cancer in the Dutch test, but it can tell us how your estrogen is breaking down. And we, as your functional medicine or integrative medicine providers, can help you work to make that break down in a healthier way. So that's one huge benefit of the Dutch test. Also in the Dutch test, you have supporting hormones, like looking at your cortisol. So that's another thing I want you to have checked out if you have the means and you are in perimenopause, because if your cortisol is all out of whack, your stress hormone, as cortisol is one of your stress hormones, it can't support your estrogen and progesterone balance. So you're going to have a rougher time period in your perimenopause time period, and you may have a rougher, a more difficult, I should say, menopause transition if your cortisol is out of whack. So I really like the Dutch test for looking at cortisol too. And that's a whole other subject. I have some videos on cortisol balance, so check those out too. But those are good. It's good to look at those supporting hormones. Another one to look at would be your thyroid. I don't know why it's so difficult for me to come up with. Thyroid is one that your doctor can check via, Quest or LabCorp blood tests, and look at if that's okay. Because if the thyroid's out of whack, it could make the progesterone, it could make the perimenopause and menopause transition a lot more difficult. So I really recommend you getting your thyroid and your cortisol if you can, but I know the thyroid is usually covered by insurance. You can check your cortisol and your blood work. I would recommend checking that between 7 and 9 in the morning. It's not as good as a urinary cortisol or a saliva cortisol. And there's some other ZRT lab makes some good saliva cortisol tests that are more affordable than the Dutch test. And that's on my Rupa lab shop, which will be connected in the description, or the link is in the description. But you could, but you can look at cortisol with your blood tests between 7 and 9 in the morning fasting if you really want to. I also recommend looking at your insulin. I have a lot of metabolic health videos, and if you are insulin resistant and you want to check that fasting in the morning also with your blood tests, if you're insulin resistant, you're going to have a more difficult time of perimenopause usually and menopause, and you could be more likely to have more of that weight gain if you're insulin resistant. So that's another just kind of accessory marker to check. Along with looking at your bone health, your fitness level, keeping all of those things optimized to make your perimenopause transition better than it might be without those things, because it can be a very rough time period of a lot of different random symptoms, and just mood-wise not feeling your best, weight-wise not feeling your best, not having energy. So definitely check out these videos and look at these numbers with your doctor, and let me know if you have any questions on these labs. Thanks so much for joining me. And if you want to learn any more about perimenopause, please leave me any ideas or any kind of hormone balance ideas for future videos. You can reach out to me on Instagram. You can reach out to me here in the comments on YouTube, and I will see you next time.